I assume this will be under 2 hours and 48 minutes.
Yes, it'll be, it'll probably be around 90 minutes, I would guess. When we look at the symbol, oops, I know, gotta remember. All right. When we look at the symbol of Aquarius, we see two parallel horizontal lines. And when modern symbolists look at it, they think of Uranus and they look at them like lightning strokes. But when the ancients looked at them, for them, everything from the latter part of the constellation of Capricorn, where there is Delphinus the dolphin, all the way to the beginning of Aries was called the sea. And these on the symbol of Aquarius were the waves of the sea. And while symbolism is a fine thing to do, and you can get a lot of detailed information out of things by looking at symbols, it's sometimes wiser to not look at the details and to simplify. And if we simplify the Aquarius symbol, we end up with two parallel horizontal lines. And that is the equal sign. And Aquarius is the sign of equals. And probably nowhere is that more apparent than in friendship, which is ruled abstractly by Aquarius and concretely by the 11th house. Now, from without, someone might judge that one person is more of a friend than another, or that one person is better than a friend, better as a friend than another, but within the friendship, that is just not possible. Friends are equals, and it's absurd to think about friends as anything but equality. If there is friendship, there is equality, and if there is no equality, there is no friendship. Now, we can say things like somebody's my best friend, but that doesn't mean that there is inequality within any friendship or relationship. We may be more intimate with one person or another, but there's still equality. So when in the Bible, as Christ is portrayed there, he declares friendship. And it's very clear if you look at that passage in St. John's Gospel, that what he meant was equality, that he was equal to them. It's a little bit distant from our topic, but the declaration of friendship by Christ tells us something about how we can conduct our relationship with Christ as equals. Personally, I have been blessed with many friendships with all sorts of people, different kinds of people. For instance, I have one friend that lives as much as she can by faith. She will ask inwardly what the Spirit wants her to do, and then she listens for the inner voice. And when it comes, she does whatever she is asked to do. She has an obedient kind of stance about it. Sometimes the Spirit tells her what it wants her to do without being asked. Now, she's very far from being a perfect person, but she is psychologically positive. So she doesn't fall prey to the kinds of spirits that would try to take over someone who was negligently receptive. They'll take advantage of such people. There's a great danger in channeling and mediumship and things like that that isn't present if it is a controlled kind of receptivity. And Controlled receptivity is without abandonment, and it's a skill. At the other end of the faith and knowledge spectrum, I have a lot of friends. And these are people who are studied and well informed about many different things. And they try to take action in their lives on the basis of what appears to be factual knowledge. To me, it's amazing how much they know and how much they keep up with things, and how sincere they are about their responsibilities to the earth or to humanity or whatever, but it's all intellectual. And they're every bit as conscientious as my friend who lives by faith. I marvel at both of these kinds of people, but I am not convinced that either of these ways is an ideal way to conduct one's life or to govern one's behavior. Both have elements that I think are ideal for true self-governance, but neither of them as a way of life I think is a right way. That's the topic for our talk tonight. It's self-governance, individual and collective self-governance. And so the title for the talk is Democracy and the Aquarian Age. Now, if we were to try to address the entire field of self-governance, it would be a very big endeavor, a huge endeavor, and it would be beyond my intellectual capacity. There are, and there have been, many different forms of government. We're not interested in all of them, and we're not interested in most of them. We're interested in spiritually trying to understand the evolutionary creation in which we are very fortunate to participate. We're trying to focus on present conditions late in the age of Pisces and their relationship to the age of Aquarius in the ongoing evolution of things. We want to work harmoniously with the evolutionary process instead of being rebellious or materialistic or whatever else might impede our progress as human beings. In the Temple of Apollo at the Oracle of Delphi, there was a famous inscription. It read, "Gnothe se auton," which in translation means, "Know thyself." So when we're trying to get to the heart of the topic that we're trying to get to this evening, we'll try to apply that to simplify things so that we can get to some valuable principles of self-governance. Now, as a speaker, I'm fortunate and bold enough to offer these talks and try to do it on the basis of self-knowledge, but I don't know if I qualify. There's a ticklish issue in all of this, and that is there is an assumption that the speaker really knows himself, which to me is a questionable assumption. Then there's an even more critical issue: is the speaker sufficiently attuned to objectivity and truth in cosmic reality to be as bold as he is? Now, fortunately, I don't have to come to those conclusions, and I have great respect for all of you, so whatever conclusions you come to is what I will go with. The speaker is a mystic, and as a mystic, he believes that the ultimate source and truth of all things is inner, in the universal spirit where everything is within. Even the world without, that we spend so much of our attention in, is within to the universal spirit. The source, the purpose, and the aim of all things is within. Currently, we have an extreme focus outwardly in matter. But that's temporary. Our existence here is to learn simple objectivity in very indubitable ways. And we learn that with the finality that concrete matter provides for us. Eventually that objectivity will be transplanted into our inner lives and our perception and function in the inner spiritual worlds. We as human beings have overdone our obsession with matter and sensualism. And we've done that so severely that we have almost lost contact with the spirit within. Some of our humanity are so taken with matter that they have become inverted in materialism. They believe that matter is all that there is, and that matter is the source of everything, including their beliefs, which is a bit self-contradictory. Nonetheless, desire for matter and material things and material experience does impel humanity forward. It keeps us going on in our evolutionary journey. You might say it's the cosmic carrot dangling from a stick. Since these things about ultimate reality are what they are, it's safe to consider that all forms, materialistic forms of government, are only temporary, and that they are temporizing just for our current conditions, with that same kind of material incentive. This means that we can discard all of the materialistic forms of government as not being pro-evolutionary. Of course, this includes capitalism and most of the forms of communism that have existed, because both of those systems were primarily about matter, materials, wealth, things like that. Now, when we say things like that, it doesn't mean that people who are adherents to these philosophies of government are bad. It just means that they are occupied with things that are not pro-evolutionary. Now, people in these systems, like in our system here in the United States, we do talk about rights and we talk about values, but it seems ultimately that money and material things are the arbiters of all governmental direction. All right, let's continue along the mildly controversial path of self-knowledge and note that the speaker is a Christian mystic. This does not mean that he is an adherent of any current or historical denomination or sect of what has been called Christianity. It does not mean that he is antagonistic toward any denomination or sect. And it also does not mean that he is antagonistic toward any religion that is not Christianity, including atheism. In fact, his view is that the moral governance of people to live well and to do better and to do good things is better because of religions than it would be without them. It's just a matter that the current historical religions are not highly efficient means for getting beyond our current materialism. They are good, but probably not good enough. They're good for controlling, but not as good for progressing people or for impelling them forward on their evolutionary career. In fact, they're less efficient in that than materialistic governmental forms. They are all shadowy and early attempts at something that was initiated by a great spiritual being 2 millennia ago. They are incipiencies. Christian mysticism is a way of love, of altruistic love in friendship with everyone. Above all, it is a way of freedom. It recognizes that the fundamental nature of everyone is spiritual, and that everyone is divine. Everyone is a God becoming. This means that there is a respect for each and every individual, and even more, it means that we aspire to love each and all. No wonder, in the face of conditions in the world, that it is incipient. All of the forms of Christian mysticism, as they agree or as they exist now, are still incipient. Now, there are collective actions in this way of life. That is, people working together, working in unity, but it's not because of conformance. It's not because of coercion or coercion by the majority, but it is because all share a common spiritual impulse. A common impulse that is based on some kind of spiritual truth. So this precludes a lot of other forms of governance. For example, anything that is authoritarian, like dictatorships, or theocracies, or coercive democracies, or some form of totalitarianism. So self-knowledge cuts away a lot of things so that there really isn't much left for a philosophy of how to govern ourselves. So let's try to continue along the path of self-knowledge, and let's try to get at something positive, something definite, instead of just merely eliminating forms of self-government, which we have done in a wholesale fashion. Now, along the way, in all of these talks, we've tried to describe from various points of view and at various different times what a human being really is. What a human being is that we can find in our own experience, but from better experience of corroborated observations of trained clairvoyance. So let's review what a human being is, and in that try to come to some understanding about governance. Our physical bodies are realities that we can't doubt, especially when they're functioning well. Even more so when they're not functioning well. We know we have bodies. So in one way of looking at our dense physical bodies, they are something laborious to carry around, and we realize that every night. But at the same time, as being something heavy to our desires, they're something that anchor us to the ground, whether we like it or not. In another way, they are marvelous vehicles for experience. And most of their functions function well all the time. Their function is so excellent that we're not even aware of most of the things taking place in the physiology of our physical bodies. Through chemistry, we know that our dense physical bodies are comprised of minerals. However, they're significantly different from the mineral kingdom. Our dense physical bodies are separate from the material kingdom, and they are unique to our individual character. We go walking a lot, and we can always tell when somebody's going to join us when we're walking because we can see their style of walking or the shape of their body or whatever like that. They're unique. Our dense physical bodies are different from the mineral kingdom in other ways. They grow, they heal, they reproduce, they change shape, and they are vitalized. Scientific mystical seers claim that this is due to a living, etheric, vital body interpenetrating the dense physical body. Everything that we see that lives has an etheric vital body. Humans, animals, plants. In humans, our vital natures and our vital bodies are every bit as unique as our physical bodies. And that's indicated by the way that they regulate and drive our metabolism. It's clear that our human vital bodies are significantly different from those of plants. The most significant difference is that our physical and vital bodies are detached from the earth, and they can move about. And they have the motivation to move about. Again, the seers claim that this is because we have desire bodies that interpenetrate our vital nature and that interpenetrate our physical nature, and they provide impetus to do things. They're comprised of emotions, feelings, desires, passions, sentiments, and other motivating factors. Everything that we see that is detached from the earth and auto-motivated must have a desire body, a desire nature in order to do this. And this includes humans and animals. As we know from animal species and other humans, the motivation of a species or of an individual human is also unique. It's special to each one. But there's a significant difference between animals and humans. We as humans can think, we can figure things out, and we can plan. Animals have a guiding wisdom behind them, but that is something very different from ratiocination by an individual. Again, the mind of each human is unique. Each of us thinks in a different way, and it's fascinating how differently we think. Just as each of us emotes in a different way. There are some commonalities. We all love and we all have anger and all of those things, but we each do it in a different way. This uniqueness is very, very important, and we'll see that in just a moment, why it is. For now, there's another quality about the mind which is important. It is that there is a being that does the thinking, and that intuitively knows the truth that is garnered in the process of thinking. And it can intuitively find ways to check out that the thinking is true. That is a being, that is a divine being that does the thinking. creation is an attribute of our divine being. So, the divine being can form concrete thoughts and do so out of universal ideas. Ideas that are everywhere true, that have only internal defining limitations. The being that is the thinker, that is a focus of a general spirit, is itself a divinely conceived idea. It is an individual spiritual focus or an individual spirit within spirit with a capital S. And that being can know the truth because it is an expression of the truth, of the one creative truth, which is why we can communicate with each other, because we all belong to the one common truth. Now, though that unique spiritual being, or self is what we call it, is equal to every other being, because it is a focus of the same altruistic spiritual love and truth, that's what we're trying to get at when we're pointing to what is called Christ, or the being that is called Christ. All right, let's put this all together. So far we can see that each of us in spirit is equal, even with the gods. And each of us is unique. And we are unique because of our differing experiences, the things we have done and the things we have not done in freedom. We have unique vehicles of consciousness, a vital form, a physical form, a desire form, and a mind. They are vehicles for obtaining consciousness. These vehicles of experience and of consequence are unique to our creative being and its creative abilities. We can't create something different than what we are. We must create from our own being. The becoming spirit develops coetaneously with the experience it has in its vehicles of consciousness. In the early involutionary stages of form, when the forms of the vehicles were developed, they were developed with the assistance of divine beings, in the same way that we assist other beings, other creatures that are now taking shape, especially in the mineral kingdom. The attributes of the spirit, which are developed in parallel and on the basis of experience, are also, or have also been, developed with the assistance of divine beings. When we awaken self-consciousness, we do that concurrently with the entering into our vehicles of consciousness. At such a time, we know we are divine beings. We know that we can govern our lives and our vehicles of consciousness. We are divine, creative, free agencies. Now, all of this that we've talked about here in probably too few sentences takes an enormously long time. It takes a long time of being molded into different forms in our form existence before we get the idea of the capacity to form an independent shape of our own. A long time for that to sink in. The same is true before a mineral can become a plant and have its own independent source of vitality. This is what happens, is when we experience something long enough, we make it our own, and we find that capacity in ourselves. But it takes a long time because consciousness is not something that is waked up of a sudden. Now, the process, the evolutionary process that we are in this great creation, is phased off. We've been looking at the phases that are visible to us in the past few sentences. We're saying that plants have more evolutionary experience than minerals because they can live and they can have independent bodies. And we're saying that animals have more evolutionary experience. They're passing through a phase whereby they can emote, which is something the plants can't do. And similarly, the humans can think, and the humans have the spirit within, and they know their own divine beings. So we can see that everything in creation, even the things that are beyond our current state of consciousness that only the few seers that there are can see, everything is phased off. Everything works together. Everything marvelously helps everything else. This has been described in a beautiful way as Jacob's ladder. Now, this is a very brief review of one small facet of the evolutionary creation, but it brings us to exactly where we want to be. We're trying to see systems that are natural to the evolutionary creation, so that if we understand those systems, we can govern ourselves according to them, and we can then work in complete harmony in the creation and have better individual as well as collective lives. We want to be harmonious with everything. So let's look at some cosmological factors, and let's do so with an eye to individual and collective self-governance. Let's begin with the first topic we looked at, and that is our various bodies, or our various vehicles of consciousness. At the human stage, the threefold spirit begins its career as a creative being. It works right within its material vehicles. It begins its career as self-consciousness, in self-consciousness. That is the beginning of its being as a becoming God. Our bodies and the lives that we experience through them are our greatest creations. This is so even for geniuses like Mozart. The bodies and the lives are the greatest creation. This is quite a sobering thing. When we consider ourselves and how sometimes we have treated our bodies and treated lives and things that we've done to them, this is a pretty sobering thought. Like many things in our human arrogance, we take our bodies for granted. Our connections to our bodies is so intimate that we don't discriminate the difference between ourselves as spiritual beings, beings of consciousness, and the bodies which are the vehicles of consciousness. Even when our dense physical bodies are ill or malfunctioning, we're so attached to them that we think we are ill. We're identified with our bodies, and that is the greater part of our being is imprisoned to the lesser part of our being because we don't discriminate spirit from form. It's the same with our actions, our emotions, and our thoughts. We do not separate ourselves from the vehicles of consciousness. We experience through our vehicles of consciousness, and we eventually spiritualize their essence, and we eventually spiritualize all the experience that we gain through them, but still we are separate from them. We are not them. And the identification with our bodies keeps us from true self-knowledge, and it keeps us from getting the most out of our bodies. It's ironic how we treat our bodies as expendable as we do. We treat them with carelessness and with abandon, even though we identify with them, which indicates that in human beings there must be a very large amount of self-destructiveness or self-hatred. We often love our automobiles better than ourselves, and we treat them better than ourselves. Our bodies, or vehicles of consciousness, are intimate to us. They're so intimate to us that they are excreta of the spirit. Some spiritual philosophers make that point with great emphasis to shock their aspirants, their students, so that they let go of their attachments and identifications. Our bodies are more than tailor-made. They are intimate creations of the Spirit. You might say exuded from the Spirit. Now, there are numerous practical applications to this knowledge. For one thing, it really raises havoc with the fashion industry or the plastic surgery industry or with things like transsexuality or things like that. We are ourselves and we are not someone else. And if we try to imitate someone else by not being true to ourselves, we make a grave mistake. And it doesn't work anyway, and it usually makes us look foolish. This doesn't mean that we can't learn from others and that we can't be influenced by them or that we shouldn't emulate others. It just means that by merely changing the outer form or in any of our vehicles of consciousness, we can't change ourselves. We change ourselves from within by seeing things that are important to us and growing toward them. All change has to be harmonious with our basic character, as it is right now. And it must issue from our own inner being, or we will not become something different. It's a very practical thing. In terms of self-governance, there is a very important point about this. In body, that is, any of our various bodies, the form of government is monarchy. Our bodies are so intimately personal as expressions of ourselves that it should raise horror in us to think of allowing some other being to enter any one of our bodies and to function from within. To do that is the ultimate of self-disrespect. So all of the fads of mediumship and channeling and such like that do not respect the spirit within. We're always told that it's some great spiritual being that has important matter to be communicated. Please let me use your body to do that. It always seems to be about the matter. It's materialism and not about the character of the spirit. If somebody is a great spiritual being and it has a lot to share, why doesn't it come to birth and share it with us? You know, it wasn't too much for Jesus or Buddha or Krishna or any other great being that has done a lot to progress humanity to come to birth and to share directly. especially to share directly through the quality of their life, rather than through some kind of mediumship or channeling. Next, we talked about the phased-off evolutionary experience. And when we look at that, we see something different. Different kingdoms or waves of divine beings have different capacities, and the differences are qualitative. There's a big difference between a mineral and a plant. This is how it is with experience. The more experience we have with something, the more we know about it, and the more we can adopt it to our own being and work with it. When we have experienced any given world sufficiently, we're capable of building directly or indirectly an independent vehicle in that world with its own laws. Our physical bodies defy the laws of physics because we, within them, can start them in motion when the laws of motion say that that shouldn't be possible. Now, we noted just a few moments ago that the life of the vegetable, animal, and human kingdom could build and function separate physical and etheric bodies, which the mineral kingdom cannot. The plants have capacities that minerals do not, and the animals have capacities that the plants do not, and so on up the line. This does not mean that the mineral kingdom does not have a value, or that it does not have a service, or that it is worthless, or anything like that. Everything that is in existence is necessary and it's essential. Without the plant kingdom, humans would soon cease to exist, as would animals. Now, this doesn't mean that ultimately the becoming beings have more capacity than others. It just means that some beings have more experience. And it means that there is a hierarchy throughout the creatures and the creators. A hierarchy that is based on experience and on capability that has been developed through that experience. Hierarchy is more important to consciousness than it is to form, even though the forms that are expressed by beings of a higher status in terms of evolutionary experience are much finer forms. It's the difference in consciousness that gives the plant kingdom greater evolutionary capacity than the mineral kingdom. It has that experience. Difference in consciousness becomes more important when waking self-consciousness is attained and creativity begins. So what we're talking about now is differences in waking self-consciousness in the process of evolutionary creation. We're talking about knowing where we are in our consciousness and about being conscious of what we are doing and where others stand in the whole process. It's difficult to tell those that are more highly evolved or that have higher creative capacities. We know that they're higher, but how much we don't know. So what we're talking about in terms of evolutionary function, when we talk about self-governance, we're talking about an aristocracy or a meritocracy or something like that. When we look at ourselves with self-judgment relative to others and to specific work, we're doing that same thing. This requires a kind of humility and even a kind of submission as well as good judgment. In our blinded materialism, our humanity has become overly proud. And we have like an evolutionary arrogance. We think that we are at the top of the creation, and we think that all of the other creatures are at our disposal. We're in for a very big surprise when we start opening up clairvoyance and see that we're closer to the bottom of the hierarchies than we are to the top. And that our evolutionary hubris has made us to be adharmonious to the whole process of evolution rather than being accelerated forms of it. So we need to be humbled so that we can fit into the process harmoniously. And it's not a bad thing to know that there are other beings that have greater capacity than we do. Once we know that everything is from spiritual intent and that the highly evolved beings are closer to the ethics of spiritual goodness than we as deviant humans are, we can learn to trust. We can learn to submit ourselves in matters where submission is important. In fact, in the book of Revelation, this is intimated very clearly. It intimates that there are very advanced spiritual leaders of humanity that will lead when they are asked to do so. So we have to open our consciousness, and we have to open our, we have to in some way shatter our pride so that we're willing to see that there are beings that can see more than we see, and that we all benefit by taking their guidance. They're not beings that are going to take advantage of us and keep us down. We, in our material darkness, are the only beings that do that kind of thing. So, when we become self-conscious, and as we become self-conscious, and we have more freedom and more voluntary action, it becomes important to express that harmoniously in a hierarchical way that works harmoniously with other beings. All right, we've looked at two factors in our basic being and our evolutionary progress. We've looked at monarchy for form, and we've looked at meritocracy or something like that with regard to evolutionary advancement for the optimal advancement. And that has led us to the third factor that we want to talk about, and that is our spiritual being. It's our spiritual being with respect for other spiritual beings. Things are much simpler when we start talking about the Spirit. The nature of the Spirit is simplicity. In the universal Spirit, as Spirit and not in manifestation, all foci of the universal Spirit are equal. It can't be any other way because they're all formed as foci using the same principles. And when one is absorbed in consciousness into spiritual unity, the differences are negligible. Even the evolutionary advancement. So when we're talking about things in spirit and in pure spirit, we're talking about complete equality. It can't be any other way. It is all one Spirit. Ultimately, the creation and the creative activities within that creation all issue from a common Spirit working to a common end. So, the form of self-governance of Spirit is democracy. It is not a representative democracy like we have now. A representative democracy is more fitting. It's a form of a hierarchical manifestation, but it's not the same thing. It's not majority rule. it is universal consensus, and it is universal consensus because everybody realizes the reality of the one common spirit is greater than focal differentiation. And it's all voluntary because all exist in freedom. Now, this unity has some of the qualities that are like monarchy, but because of the participatory spirit, it's different. Individual differences don't matter in spirit, nor does evolutionary capacity. In spirit, we're all equal. When there are rests in the great evolutionary creation, everything goes back to pure spirit, and everything is enriched by the experience of every other focus in the universal spirit. So there is a common sense of unity. That's like something like monarchy. This is a realm of love in the highest sense. So there is no self-weakening in being equal to everyone else. There is no self-separation, which is weakening. So in this, there is democracy. Loving respect and harmony with all in the one. That's democracy. All selves are created equal. After all of that, we have to come back down to where we are here and now. We are in self-exiled materialistic blindness to the spiritual worlds. We are in the late stages of the age of Pisces, and we are seeking in these talks to harmoniously and optimally work our way into the age of Aquarius. In most of the world around us now, we see some form of representative democracy. Though materialism and capitalism seem to dominate over the true democratic parts of it. What do we do in order to more efficiently bring ourselves into harmony with the ideal of democracy? That's the question we're trying to ask. What do we do in order to make ourselves harmonious to the true ideal of democracy? To answer that, let's go back and look at the two types of friends that we talked about at the beginning of this talk. Now, it would seem to be a wonderful thing to have divine guidance in every little thing in life, as my friend does. One would never make any mistakes, and one would always know what to do. Always? No, it's not always. It doesn't work that way. My friend has inner guidance, but not always. She has remarkable and unusual experience. She does things that other people don't do just because of being asked to do them, and most people wouldn't even think of doing them. She'll just get on a bus and go to Chicago because she was told to do it. But she also makes mistakes, and she sins the way the rest of us do. Now, one might think that if she had more higher etheric material in her soul body, that she would have continuous guidance. But I don't think that's so. If we were to have continuous inner guidance and direction, we would be something like human automatons. We would just walk through life. It would be like a director in a theater giving us instructions of what to do next. It's good that we can question things, and that we can investigate things, and that we can think for ourselves, even if we make mistakes. It's true that we learn some things by experience first, and then when we go through the experience we know them. But if we stay in a state of consciousness where we're obedient, passively obedient all of the time, that isn't going to happen. There's no substitute for a questioning mind. Great care and an enormous amount of time have been spent in helping us to develop and build an independent mind. And it wasn't for no purpose. Through our minds we can understand things and not just know the specifics and not just do actions that we are told to do. Through our minds we become akin to the gods. We can create and we can see things from a divine vantage point. Now, probably all of us would benefit from the kind of guidance that my friend has, because we wouldn't get lost in a lot of the minutiae of life, in a lot of petty things, if we were told to just walk right through them. But we would be much better if we could be ambidextrous in our consciousness, so that we could move into receptivity and obedience when that was appropriate, and when that quality could be teamed together with creative thinking. This is what we're trying to develop. We're trying to develop a personality that carries out divine guidance, but not necessarily blindly, but that the divine guidance comes from our own divine being. And this means a coordination of a higher, broader kind of consciousness with a lower, more specific consciousness. These are things that we want to keep in mind when we design and develop our consciousness through interactivity. Because what our consciousness is going to be like in the future depends on what kind of view we have of it. And if we have that combination of obedience and of higher vision, we're going to develop that. Now for a moment, let's look at the other friends that were mentioned earlier. They're thoughtful, they're conscientious, they're studious, they're high-minded, they're idealistic. Some of them have an erudition that seems to approach Aquarian infinitude. Aquarius is that sign of total knowledge. These are people that mean well, and they try to act well, but sometimes they miss the mark. And sometimes they miss the mark quite widely. And one wonders why this is so. And it is so, or at least it seems to be so, because their intellection is irrelevant to the true issue. One can get lost in voluminous information, just as one can get lost in senses in the petty little things of life. And when we're lost, we sometimes go the wrong way, and it seems like we're going the right way, and we can get quite far afield because of it. Sometimes acting or not acting on the basis of an ideal can have mortal consequences if the ideal is wrong for the situation. I know this because it cost the life of a friend because I was working on the wrong ideal than was correct for the situation. Aquarian erudition and Aquarian idealism must have Aquarian intuition, and it must have Aquarian transcendental experience or it is useless and even misleading. Aquarian transcendental experience, with its divine altruistic values, is what we really want. That's the big picture, not just a lot of studying things from books. The form of self-governance most fit for the state of consciousness must be like what it issues from in order to be applied. The form of self-governance must fit the consciousness from which it issues if it is to be applied. We have democracy now, but it's not Aquarian democracy. It's more like mob rule, and it's the tyranny of the majority. What the majority want for themselves selfishly is what dominates our democracy. It's not, so we're not a democracy attuned to the democracy that issues from that Aquarian principle. Most people aren't aware of this, and they don't even care about the bigger universal picture. Most people, if you talk to them, the conversation turns to their career or to their kids or things like that, and most people really don't think about the evolutionary purposes. That's why we have such a small number of people here, because people aren't doing that. So materialistic blindness is led by people appealing to the desires of other people or into things that flatters them. We know about what happens with advertising. True Aquarian democracy took a big hit last week with the Supreme Court. So this is where we stand relative to the Aquarian Age. We have freedom to elect, but the freedom is minimal. We have democracy, but it is not effectively based on the spiritual state from which democracy issues. What can we do? The first thing that usually comes up, change the system. And after a life of watching this, I am of the opinion that changing the system doesn't work. It's no different than changing stations on a radio if the radio is broke. If people are wrong, they will be wrong in any system. So the obvious answer seems to be to change people. However, one does not change people from without, because changing people from without, or trying to do that, is another definition of a system. We, the people, have to change from within. And it must be free change, and it must be volitional change. We have to respect our own divinity, just as the gods respect it. So how do we change from within? Spiritual exercises. Appropriate spiritual exercises is how we change. Spiritual exercises. Yep, this entire talk is, among other things, a pitch to try to persuade people to do spiritual exercises. We don't have time to go into spiritual exercises right now, but there are appropriate spiritual exercises that are completely harmonious with the cosmological principles. They function on the same things that the cosmos functions on. And they lead to the universal and specific consciousness that we can see is so desirable in order to function as individual personalities and as foci of a universal spirit. They combine the quality of living by faith and the ability to know things. Now, a lot of people cannot do spiritual exercises because they don't have time. In such a case, there are things that we can do on the fly. We can apply a version of a maxim that comes from the appropriate technology movement. That statement is, think globally, act locally. For us, a modification would probably go something like, attune universally, act personally. Attune universally, act personally. That's all I have for tonight.
That was brilliant.
We actually got done in a small amount of time.
It's excellent.
Huh?
It's excellent.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. The whole lecture was written in on the Dominican woman's apartment in Miami. I had an afternoon that I didn't have anything to do, and I couldn't talk to her because I didn't have enough Spanish and she didn't have enough English. And so I had the afternoon to do, and I couldn't pray all afternoon, so I just sat there and composed the whole talk.